Thanks for joining in for today's webinar. We have a few announcements to get things started today. The Johnson Center hosts several free webinars throughout the year. The next one will be this Thursday, April 4th, when Dr. Rundle presents part 2 of this 3-part series. You can see the full list of future free webinars by going to www.johnson-center.org and clicking on the webinars link on the right-hand side. You can also join our email list there and stay up to date on all events and opportunities by clicking on the Join Our Email List link on the homepage. We currently have some terrific family support programs, including grants and sliding fee scales for diagnostic services, counseling support, sibling camps, and more. If you'd like more information, please contact us at info@johnson-center.org. These support programs are funded in large part by our community support and in honor of April being Autism Awareness and Acceptance Month. We will once again be hosting an online auction to raise critical funds for these grant support programs. From April 15th until April 30th, you will be able to bid on hundreds of items, and 100% of the proceeds will go directly to family support grants. The auction goes live April 15th, so be sure to check out the auction at www.takeactionforautism.org. Be sure to follow our colleagues at the Autism Research Institute, as they also host several great webinars and share some great resources on their website and social media pages. If you would like a certificate of attendance after today's webinar, look for a follow-up email in your mailbox 1 hour after the webinar concludes, or look for the link on our YouTube channel in the webinar description. It will contain instructions on how to get your certificate. If you have questions during the live webinar, please type them into your GoToWebinar control panel or email info@johnson-center.org. If you are watching a recording of this webinar, you may email questions to the presenter at info@johnson-center.org. And be sure to check out our library of past webinars on our YouTube channel at www.youtube.com/The Johnson Center. Today's webinar is presented by Dr. Rundle. Dr. Rundle is a licensed clinical psychologist here at the Johnson Center. After completing her doctoral work at the California School of Professional Psychology in San Diego, she moved to Austin in order to continue to provide psychological services in her home state. She's trained in psychological and neuropsychological assessments, and she also has years of training providing individual and group therapy for adults and adolescents, providing play therapy for children, and in facilitating social skills groups for children with neurodevelopmental disorders. Please welcome Dr. Jana Rundle.
Thanks, Morgan, for that great introduction. All right. So today is the first part in my Mind Your Mind webinar series. So we're going to be going through 3 different subjects. The first is anxiety, which we'll talk about today. Then we will talk about depression on Thursday, and then sleep on next Tuesday. And I wanted to do them close together because not only is our depression, anxiety, and sleep issues really common in the autism spectrum disorder population, but they also have a lot of overlap with symptoms and treatment. And so because, you know, they're all kind of interrelated, I wanted to do them close together because the information that I'll be presenting today really is relevant to the information that I'll be presenting on Thursday and also on next Tuesday. So I'm really excited about this series. I'm really trained as an individual therapist, but I also have a lot of experience in neuropsychological and psychological testing. So at the Johnson Center, I do both. I do both testing and diagnostics as well as individual therapy. So a lot of my interests lie in kind of the therapy realm, which is why I've picked these topics. And they're really important for not only our ASD population, but just our population in general, because all of us have periods of time where we might be anxious and overwhelmed, or, you know, a life event may kind of lead us into a sad and depressed state. And sleep issues are also really rampant in our culture. And so I really wanted to focus on these things because I think they're really relevant and important to focus on. So today we're going to talk about anxiety, and we're going to talk about kind of our agenda is kind of an overview of anxiety, what it is, the symptoms. Then we'll talk about specific special considerations for anxiety in the autism spectrum disorder population. So just special considerations for the ASD population. Really the treatment for anxiety is the same for everyone, right? So like anybody, if they're getting treatment for anxiety, the treatment's going to be similar across the board. But when we're thinking about the autism population, there are just some special considerations that we need to take into account. And then the last thing we'll talk about, and we'll spend a lot of time actually talking about, is the treatment of anxiety and what we do when individuals are anxious. All right, so what is anxiety? Anxiety is worry, right? So it really occurs when the demands from the environment are greater than our ability to cope with them, right? So when our stress level kind of overpowers our ability to cope. Stress and worry are really natural emotions. All of our emotions are really natural, right? They're just kind of given to us biologically. We don't really have any, willingness to affect them, but it's really their stress and anxiety are natural emotions. Biologically, when we think about stress and anxiety, they're adaptive, right? They help us prepare for when things go wrong. So imagine, historically, when we were hunters and gatherers, being faced by some sort of lion or some sort of animal. Anxiety is something that naturally occurs that helps us fight or flee from something that could possibly hurt us. So like if you were faced with a lion, you might experience increased heart rate, respiration, the body would release hormones and adrenaline to give us a boost of energy. All of those things really allow us to either fight our predators or run away from them successfully. So in a way, anxiety has allowed our species to survive. It's adaptive, it helps us. It can become a problem when it becomes more severe, right? When it interferes with daily living. But when I think about anxiety, it can seem like such a negative word, but in reality, it really helps us more than you think. Like a little bit of mild anxiety, for instance, just thinking about preparing for this webinar, we have a date and a time that this webinar is taking place. It's on my schedule. So having just a little bit of kind of a drop dead date when this needed to occur, having that mild anxiety of, oh, I have to get this done, this is on my plate, really helps us prepare. So mild anxiety can be really helpful for us all. For example, having a test. We know we need to prepare for the test, so having that anxiety helps us motivate to perform. There's a lot of research actually on Olympic athletes and how they handle the anxiety of extreme performance. For Olympic athletes at that top level, anxiety is really helpful. When it becomes excessive, that's when we need to worry about it. And when we think about disorders in general, we have this whole handbook of disorders called the DSM, right? And there's hundreds of things in there. And for most of those things, anxiety, depression, insomnia, all of those problems only become disorders when they start interfering with your life. So just because you are an anxious person, just because you may be sad at some times, that's all really normal. When we're talking about disorders and things that need treatment, in order to be a disorder, it really has to affect some sort of functioning, whether that be academic functioning, social and emotional functioning, work functioning. So things become disordered or abnormal when your functioning gets impaired. But when we think about anxiety and fear, those are really normal adaptive things that we feel every day. So let's talk about anxiety versus fear. So fears are really normal parts of our lives. We're kind of born with them. So even when you think about babies, babies get separation anxiety at a predictable stage in their development. So starting around 6 to 9 months, a baby might start getting kind of that stranger danger phase where if a stranger comes in the room, they may get upset. That's natural. They're not causing that to happen. That's just biology at work. And as children get older, they may begin to show other natural fears of insects, fear of the dark, fear of the supernatural. For most of us, fear is a feeling that we get when we come face to face with something scary. So I have this picture of a guy who's obviously scared of spiders. That's a very common fear. It's a natural fear for us to be scared of bugs that are poisonous or bugs that can hurt us. It's a normal reaction to something that might injure us or poison us. So how do we decide when a fear becomes abnormal? Well, in reality, we really don't. All fears are normal. Even when you think of anxiety as a disorder, so let's take like a germ phobia, for instance. Even an excessive fear of germs, which can lead to excessive hand washing, can simply be seen as a normal fear of germs that has become extreme, right, or excessive. So a fear of germs is really normal because germs can make us sick. When it starts interfering with life, that can lead to anxiety. So anxiety can be thought of as normal fears that have just become more extreme or more intrusive in our lives. And also that idea that anxiety is not only fear, but it's that fear, that what if, right? So I have this picture of this guy who is so clearly anxious, and he's thinking, what if? So anxiety is kind of that idea of the anticipation of danger, and it can really start impacting our life in a really negative way. Now we're going to talk about the fight or flight response. So when we see a threat, our brain begins to start a cascading series of events that's called the fight or flight response. And many of us have heard of this response. It's a biological response of our body to prepare for incoming danger, right? So it's that the thing our body does that either prepares us to fight a predator or to run away to protect ourselves. And it's a natural response. We don't, have anything, it just happens naturally. So chemicals are released in our brain. It triggers a release of epinephrine, which is adrenaline, into the bloodstream that starts kind of this cascading series of events. So our pupils will dilate, it'll let in more light into our eyes. We may start trembling, we may start rapid heartbeat and breathing really rapidly. All of these things help prepare us to either fight a predator or to run away from a predator. And when we think about it, when we get really nervous and when that fight or flight response kicks in and our heart rate increases and we start breathing really quickly, all of that lets in more oxygen to our bodies. And that oxygen powers our muscles, that oxygen goes to our brain, it makes us more alert. All of these things help prepare us for potential predators. It helps keep us alive to either fight the predator or to run away quickly from the predator. So that fight or flight response is a really natural response to danger. What happens, though, in our culture now is that we're not really faced with these kinds of dangers anymore. When is the last time that you became face-to-face with a lion? I've been to Africa, so I actually have been face-to-face with a lion before, and it was very scary. But in our daily life, this doesn't happen. So these natural kind of biological chemicals that are released can really start affecting us in a negative way because we're not made to experience the chronic fight or flight response that happens when we experience anxiety. We're supposed to, this fight or flight response is supposed to be short term. It's supposed to help us get away from a predator, either fight a predator or get away from the predator, survive, and go back to our regular mundane lives. But that's not what happens with anxiety. Anxiety becomes really chronic, and we become in this constant state of fight or flight that really affects kind of the homeostasis of our bodies and can create a lot of negative things that happen in our bodies because we're not meant to be in a constant state of awareness and hyperarousal. So we'll talk about, as we go through these slides, what we can do to prevent this chronic worry. But first, let's talk about the symptoms of anxiety. So when we're thinking about symptoms of anxiety, it's different for everyone, of course, but some common ones are kind of the mental symptoms of anxiety or the cognitive symptoms of anxiety. For example, that could be ruminative negative thoughts, which just means that you're constantly thinking negative thoughts. Rumination is just like that ability to just think about something over and over and over again. And that can be one of the hallmark symptoms, cognitive symptoms at least, of anxiety. Also feeling overwhelmed, difficulty concentrating, that feeling that you're out of control, helplessness or hopelessness, anger, shame, all of those feelings can be kind of the cognitive symptoms of anxiety. Physical symptoms could include shallow breathing, hyperventilation, adrenaline rush, pounding heartbeat, sweating, shaking, muscle tension, dry mouth, headaches, nausea, diarrhea, vomiting, hives, fatigue, difficulty eating or sleeping. So many physical symptoms of anxiety. And really, that goes back to what I was saying before, that we're really not meant to be in this constant state of hyperarousal. And a lot of the symptoms of anxiety kind of manifest in the physical realm because our bodies are kind of like freaking out at all of these hormones that are cascading through our system that really shouldn't be there. So it can create a lot of physical problems, physical symptoms, and they all kind of, relate together. If you have a lot of anxiety and you're having difficulty sleeping, we'll talk about that in my third webinar of the series, creates a lot of they all kind of work together, right? If you have anxiety, then you have difficulty sleeping, and if you can't sleep, then you're anxious. It's kind of a vicious cycle, right? And then we have the behavioral symptoms, which could be avoidance, so maybe avoiding certain activities or certain people, acting out behaviors, angry outbursts or tantrums. A really common one in kids is that school refusal or task refusal, so not wanting to go to school or not wanting to do what you're asking them to do, crying, sleep problems. All of those can be like the behavioral manifestations of anxiety. So when we think about anxiety when it relates to ASD specifically, we want to remember that anxiety is chronic. So it can often be it's something that needs to be addressed. And with the autism spectrum disorder, studies really vary on the percentage, but we do know from a lot of studies that the comorbidity, which means the amount of people that have both autism spectrum disorder and pretty significant anxiety symptoms, is really high. So in the normal population of kiddos, when we're talking about neurotypical kiddos, so kiddos without a neurodevelopmental disorder, research shows between 1 and 7% of neurotypical kiddos have some symptoms of anxiety, which is really low. And that makes sense. Most kiddos should be doing kiddo things, right? Like playing on the playground and going to school. When we think about autism, the studies really vary, but we're going to say anywhere between 25 to 85%, the studies have shown that kiddos with ASD will show anxiety symptoms. So even if we take the conservative number, the 25%, which is the lowest number that studies have shown, that's still quite a bit higher than that 1 to 7%. So we know that there's something specific about anxiety and autism that is making these kids more susceptible to anxiety. And we'll talk a little bit about why that is. But we just know that kiddos with ASD suffer from symptoms of anxiety at a much higher rate than our neurotypical peers. So why might that be? So studies have shown that even at a resting rate, individuals with ASD have a nervous system that's really on high alert. So it's producing stress chemicals at a higher rate than their neurotypical peers. So when we're thinking about what we were talking about earlier with that fight or flight response, that's what you want to be thinking about. So individuals, even that are just hanging out, just resting, they're producing those stress chemicals, that adrenaline and epinephrine, at a higher rate than kiddos without autism. So anxiety and autism can manifest in a variety of different ways. Oftentimes we'll hear about the kind of obsessive compulsive behaviors or the oppositional defiance, rigid thinking. Often you'll see it perseverative thought, so just kind of perseverating on things, reliance on rituals or routines, mood swings. Anxiety treatment is kind of similar across the board, but when we think about autism and anxiety, the most common thing I think that I see clinically is that anxiety around changes in routine. So difficulty with transitions and changes in routine, and then secondary to that, I think sensory issues are probably just anecdotally the most common things that parents complain about, with that the transitions and the changes in routine really kind of like really ramping up those anxiety symptoms in their kids. So some researchers think that anxiety levels may be higher in individuals with ASD because individuals with ASD are more sensitive to sensory inputs. We know that just that's one of kind of the hallmark symptoms of autism, is that difficulty with sensory information coming in. So decreasing the negative sensory inputs and increasing positive sensory inputs could be crucial for lowering anxiety levels, for example. One of the things that I promote heavily as a psychologist is just the idea of getting out into nature. So that would be a way to increase positive sensory inputs. It's still sensory inputs. You know, you have the birds chirping and the wind blowing, but that's a positive sensory inputs, and we really spend far too much time indoors anyways. So that's a great way to increase positive sensory inputs and then try to decrease the negative sensory inputs. So that could be just a way to do that is also to get outside, because then you don't have the artificial lights, you don't have the beeping of technology and the chiming, and all of those things can be really kind of disruptive to the way we regulate ourselves. So that's a really important thing to think about as parents, is how to promote positive sensory inputs and decrease negative sensory inputs for our kiddos with ASD, especially if you're thinking about a kiddo who is not as verbal as some of their peers. This can be a really great way to minimize anxiety because they're not going to be able to maybe tell you that they're anxious, but you can kind of adapt their environment that's going to promote more self-soothing and more less anxious behavior. All right, so kiddos on the spectrum are naturally motivated to escape and avoid novelty and uncertainty. So just in general, the way their brains are wired, they like things they can control. So lining up cars, spinning things, fixating on repetitive patterns or doing repetitive behaviors, all of those things are things that they control, and they tend to gravitate towards those things. So they want the world to be the same. They want it to be predictable. That's just kind of how their brains are wired. So instead of being motivated to seek novelty, like a lot of kids are that want to explore and want to try new things, that's not really common in ASD. In ASD, kiddos like to do things that are routine, predictable, things that they can, that aren't uncertain. So, you think about some of the symptoms of anxiety, kind of the rigid thinking, rituals that are become obsessive, compulsive interests. All of that is kind of seen as a way to escape and avoid the scary novelty and uncertainty that comes with the world. So if we can kind of understand why these behaviors are occurring, I think we can develop some empathy for, yeah, the world is a super scary place. And if you're someone who really likes routine, then changing that routine can be really anxiety provoking. So I think as parents and as clinicians, we just need to be really aware and understanding that they are navigating the world the best way they know how. And to a kiddo with autism, a world that is predictable and the same and something that they can wrap their head around. When things become unpredictable, that's when anxiety can really skyrocket. And you might see a kiddo that kind of withdraws into their own kind of static world of rituals and routines because of the sameness and the predictability. So when we're thinking about treating anxiety with the autism population, one of the most important things we'll do as clinicians is to teach emotional regulation. So basically what emotional regulation is exactly like it sounds. It's regulating our emotions. It requires the ability to know what emotion you're feeling, why you're feeling that way, and then calming down. So identifying emotions and then recognizing how to regulate those emotions is kind of the hallmark of emotional regulation. And it's important for all of us to do that. If you just think about entering the workplace and the amount of emotional regulation that one has to do navigating different workplace environments, different managerial styles, if you think about The Office, if you ever watch The Office and you have a Dwight Schrute in your office, the amount of emotional regulation that happens kind of navigating those office personalities is a really important thing that we need to master. And so it's important to teach that skill because kiddos on the spectrum often, this is difficult for them to recognize their own feelings and the feelings of others and then regulate them is something that they really struggle with. So when we're thinking about emotional regulation in the ASD population, with a neurotypical kiddo, we would probably teach a lot of kind of cognitive skills. So, using words to explain how we're feeling and the feelings of others. That's not going to be something that a kiddo on the spectrum is going to really excel at. So when we think about treating anxiety in autism specifically, we tend to try to focus on situations. So situations are going to be much easier to manage than jumping right into the cognitions or why someone is anxious or why someone is feeling that way. So we try to recognize the situational challenges, the things that really set people off, because it can be really a lot harder for kiddos on the spectrum to identify exactly what emotion they may be feeling. But it's usually pretty easy for them to identify what situations are stressful and then coming up with a plan of how to do it. So we usually try to focus on the situations themselves of identifying, okay, what situations are hard for you and what can we do to make them easier? And then once we've gotten that down and the arousal is kind of lowered, then we can start working on the cognitions and the feelings and identifying feeling states. But typically we tend to start with the situations themselves. So why is emotion regulation so difficult for our ASD population? For one thing, feelings are not logical or concrete. So emotional responses are often unpredictable. So for instance, you might walk by a coworker today and smile at them, and then they may return the smile. And then tomorrow you may walk by that same coworker and smile at them, and perhaps something else is going on and they either don't see the smile or they are in a bad mood and don't return the smile. So emotional responses like this are super unpredictable. We can't predict how one person is going to behave one day as compared to another day. So for a kiddo on the spectrum, these kinds of social nuances are really difficult. So a neurotypical kid might see that kind of situation where one person has smiled one day and not smiled the other, and they'll probably blow it off as, okay, well, so be it. But a kiddo on the spectrum might be really confused by that. Well, why didn't they smile? Because to them, me smiling plus you smiling equals happiness. So X plus Y equals Z for a kiddo on the spectrum. But that's not really how emotions work. Emotions are so complex. They're not logical. They're not predictable. And navigating that for a kiddo on the spectrum can be really difficult. I often think of and give the example to my kiddos if they've seen Star Trek, and I'm not a Trekkie, so I apologize if I'm getting this totally wrong, but I think of Dr. Spock in Star Trek. Spock is he's from a logical race of species, and he doesn't understand kind of the emotional nuances of the human species, right? He gets really confused as to why humans do the things that they do and why emotions play such a big role in human life. So when I think about autism and the difficulties that kiddos on the spectrum can really have in that emotion regulation, I think about Dr. Spock, because to a kiddo on the spectrum, they want things to be logical. They want X plus Y to equal Z. And the emotional world doesn't operate like that. And how difficult that can be if you're expecting the emotional world to operate like that. So part of a clinician's job is to kind of explain that no, emotions don't operate like that. And what can we do when we become really confused about emotions and when we become really hyper aroused by certain situations? And it takes time to teach those nuances and those skills. But it's really beneficial because in the world, in the workplace, in long-term relationships, emotion regulation is kind of a hallmark of those things. We have to have the ability to recognize emotions in others, recognize our own emotions, and regulate them, right? That's kind of how we maintain our long-term relationships, which are so important to us in our world. So just the idea of emotion regulation really relies on that ability to kind of self-monitor, which is difficult for kiddos on the spectrum because they have those core impairments in the social emotional realm. All right, so targets for intervention. Like I just talked about, emotion regulation and recognition are going to be the two main targets for intervention when you're talking about anxiety. So just that ability to recognize your own emotion and then regulate it. And sometimes, you know, like I said, we'll start out with situational things, so identifying which situations bring anxiety and then learning to regulate it. And then we'll move on to identifying our own feeling states and the feeling states of others. And then we always want to work on communication and social skills because those are part of the kind of symptom cluster of autism, are those communication and social deficits. So we always want to be targeting those. And we'll talk about specific ways to do that in the coming slides. All right, so I'm going to start talking about the treatments for anxiety and exactly how we treat these anxiety symptoms. So the first thing that I want to talk about is deep breathing, because y'all might have already heard about the benefits of deep breathing, but it's probably one of the most helpful tools that psychologists use in treating all kinds of things. So research has kind of shown that practicing deep breathing can be beneficial in a range of different disorders and different symptoms. So I'm going to show y'all this video of how to do deep breathing. And I know it's kind of silly because it's like we all know how to breathe, but we really don't actually. We tend to breathe from our chest instead of from our diaphragm. And research has actually shown that like kiddos that are born like babies and as they develop breathe from their diaphragm because that's how we are supposed to breathe. And then sometime around like age 6 or 7, kids change the way they breathe and start breathing from their chest. And we don't know why, but it probably has something to do with going to school and sitting for long periods of time. But you know, naturally, biologically, we're supposed to be breathing from our diaphragm. And we really stopped doing that, probably just based on how we live and the culture that we live in. We spend a lot of time inside, we spend a lot of time in front of the computer, and that affects how we breathe. So I do think it's important to talk about this, even though some of you may be thinking that you know how to breathe, but a lot of us really aren't breathing correctly. And taking those shallow breaths from our chest instead of using the deep breaths from our diaphragm tricks your body into thinking that it's in that fight or flight mode. So when we take those shallow breaths, your body, that sympathetic nervous system is kicking in and that adrenaline is pumping and the stress hormones are being released. And all of these cascading events are happening because your body thinks that it's in some sort of stressful situation. When we can breathe from our diaphragm, it kicks in that parasympathetic nervous system, which is going to bring all of those things that are happening in the fight or flight system back down, and you're going to get back to your normal state, which is where we need to be for most of our life because we're not in danger most of the time. So if you're watching a YouTube recording of this webinar, you might not see the video, and so I've put the YouTube link on this slide. So if you don't see the video because you're watching a recording, then you can go to this link and watch it. It's really great. But if you're watching live, then you should be able to watch this video right now. So we'll watch a video of how to do deep breathing from the diaphragm. Okay, so that was just a little example of how to breathe from your diaphragm. And I think it's super helpful to have that knowledge because we can practice deep breathing anywhere. Sometimes I practice it in my office, if I'm watching TV. So you can easily practice these kinds of skills that will help kind of reset your body, bring on that parasympathetic nervous system that we should be experiencing all the time anyways, and get those stress hormones to kind of dissipate throughout the body. So super effective, really easy. And I just wanted everyone to know, because you can use this for anxiety, depression. We'll talk about breathing techniques throughout our webinars. So that's just a little overview about breathing from the diaphragm. All right. So when we think about treatments for anxiety, what we'll usually do is we'll talk about the situations that are stressful for a kiddo or for an adult. And then we'll try to, can't see my screen, let me share. Hopefully y'all can see my screen now. We'll see. They will let me know if you can't see my screen. Okay, great. All right, so here's the treatments for anxiety. So when we talk about treatments for anxiety, we'll think about certain situations that are stressful. So for this example, I've come up with asking someone to play. So that's a situation that is anxiety provoking for a certain kid. So the physiological arousal that happens, nervousness, anxiety. So when we think about the situation, then we have the effects of that situation, which are the physiological arousal. And then we have the behaviors that occur, which could be running away, avoiding the situation, yelling no. Well, we don't want that type of behavior. So how do we intervene and create the desired behavior, which would be actually asking someone to play? Well, we want to intervene where that physiological arousal happens. So we'll do an intervention when the physiological arousal happens. And at that moment, we'll practice calming strategies. So it could be the deep breathing that we just talked about in the slide before, or other calming strategies that we'll talk about in the next few slides. But that's where we want to intervene. So once we get nervous, we want to intervene there. We want to practice our calming strategies so that the behavior can change and that we can actually ask someone to play. We're not so aroused that we are just running away or avoiding the situation altogether. So that's how you think about treatments for anxiety, is identifying the situations that are stressful, that are anxiety provoking, experiencing the anxiety, and then practicing calming strategies to dissipate the anxiety so that the behavior can be changed, so that a better behavior can happen. So as a clinician, I often incorporate a stress hierarchy, and basically what that is a list of different stressful events, and you have the client item or list the stressful events in order of 1 being the least stressful to whatever the highest number being the most stressful. Just ordering the different events as in level of stressfulness. And that gives you kind of an idea of what is stressful for the client, but also kind of shows you where to intervene. So we want to start our interventions kind of in the moderate range of stress, because if something's a 1, you know, that's not really involving much stress. If something's a 12, the most stressful, that's not where we want to intervene, because that'll be so overwhelming for the person that they'll never come back to treatment, or they'll never talk to me again. So we kind of want to intervene in the middle area where things are kind of stressful, kind of, you know, freaking out, but not to the point where you can't calm down. So that's why we create the hierarchy, so we kind of know what we're looking at and where we want to start intervention. So we usually start somewhere in the mid-range. And I usually try to incorporate kind of a thermometer because it's easy to understand. You know, are you way down on the thermometer? Are you in the green level? Are you all good? Or are you way up here at the red, like just not functioning? So this kind of helps us know what the kiddo, or even the adult, because the treatment for this is all the same, is feeling in the moment. So we want to kind of get to the number 6 is where we kind of want to start, where you're like, okay, I'm stressed out a little bit. I'm feeling it, but I'm not to the, you know, the point where I'm really, really, really overwhelmed. So we start kind of at a 6, And then we would introduce the person to whatever situation is stressing them out. And then we practice our calming strategies, and it depends on the person of what's effective, but breathing is effective for everyone. So we'll just say we'll practice our deep breathing, we'll practice our breathing techniques, and then reassess and say, okay, now we've done our breathing techniques, where are you on the scale? Okay, I'm a little bit lower, I'm a 5 now. Okay, great. And then we'll work our way up the hierarchy. And this is not, a quick fix. This takes weeks of treatment, but that is kind of how to think about anxiety treatment. That's really what we're doing when we're treating anxiety is, exposing the person to stressful situations and then practicing calming strategies that allows the person to A, handle the situation so that they can get confidence, and B, it teaches the person that the situation is not going to have all the dreaded consequences that we fear, right? Because they're going to be faced with the situation, like let's say asking someone to play again is, really high on our, that's super stressful. So when we're faced with it, asking someone to play, we practice our calming strategies, and then we can actually do it because we're now calm. And then we realize, okay, it's not that bad. It's not as bad as I once thought it was. And then we work our way up the hierarchy and do something else the same way. We introduce the situation, we practice our calming strategies, and then we assess the level of the anxiety and hope it should be going down, because that's kind of how this treatment works, is when you're exposed to it and you realize, okay, it's not really that harmful, then our stress level goes down. Another technique that we use that I'll talk about kind of in our other webinars as well is the idea of mindfulness. So mindfulness is a super hot topic right now. There is a lot of research on mindfulness. So not just in the area of anxiety, but in chronic pain and substance abuse, in depression and insomnia. Mindfulness is kind of helpful across the board. So I would be really doing a disservice if I didn't focus on mindfulness. Mindfulness also is a tool that can just be used for wellness. Like, it just being mindful is being well. And I think all of us could use more wellness in our life. So we're going to talk a little bit about mindfulness and what it is and how to incorporate it in our everyday life. So I have this quote: "I'm an old man now. I've lived a long and difficult life filled with so many misfortunes, most of which have never happened." And that's a quote from Mark Twain, but I think that just really embodies kind of the American culture these days. We have so many worries that we spend our time thinking about and spend our energy thinking about that don't ever happen, right? And that's what anxiety is that anticipation of bad things happening that we really have no control over. So as a clinician, I often tell my clients focusing on the future and the unknown is going to bring a lot of anxiety, because we have no control over the future. We cannot predict the future. Focusing on the past and things that we've already done and we can't change is going to bring depression. So when we focus on the future, we get really anxious. When we focus on the past, it can lead to depression. But the present moment is really where we should be spending our energy, because there's peace in the present moment. In the present moment, I am here, I am safe, I am breathing, my feet are on the floor. In the present moment, there's peace. So that's what basically the whole idea of mindfulness is: get out of your head of focusing on the future, get out of the depression of, dwelling on the past, and get into the present moment. That is what mindfulness is. So important for our wellness. So how do we practice mindfulness? And let me just say that it is a practice. It is not something, at least for me, it's not something that comes super easy or naturally. It's definitely something that takes time to be intentional about. I think for some people it does come more easy, but for me, I am not someone who, is super into yoga, who's doing a lot of meditation. It's definitely something that I have to be intentional about, that I have to schedule into my day. But with the intention and with the practice, it does become easier. It becomes more second nature. And the benefits way outweigh the awkwardness or the difficulties of leading a more mindful life, because the benefits are better wellness, and that, that's pretty priceless. So let's think about ways to really incorporate more mindfulness into our lives. And I think when you're thinking about ways to do this in your own life, or to try to incorporate this in your kiddos' lives, give yourself some grace. It's not easy. It doesn't come second nature. I think especially if you're an American, we're so busy, going. So this idea of taking a break and being present kind of goes against the whole core of our culture. So definitely give yourself grace. Start small. I like to start with a 1-minute meditation. So that was actually one of my New Year's resolutions, was to practice more meditation, just because as a clinician, I prescribe it so much as homework, that we need to be more meditative, that we need to be more mindful, and I need to practice what I preach. So I've been working on incorporating this in my own life, and I'll just tell you what I have done that has been helpful, but just know that you have to find whatever works for you. But for me, starting small, doing a 1-minute mindfulness. I use guided meditation, so you can just Google guided meditation. There's tons of guided meditations online on YouTube, on different websites that are free, that you can just watch 1 minute out of your day. That could really affect your level of peace. So I think start small and see what works and what doesn't. But that is what worked for me, is trying to find a very short guided meditation, because I think it's easier to listen to a guided meditation of someone talking than to try to clear my mind on my own. And I'm sure once you get good at this, you can easily clear your mind. But for me, I really find it easier to do a guided meditation. And this is a great time to also practice your breathing that you just learned a few slides ago, to do your diaphragmatic breathing. So that is how I've incorporated mindfulness in my life, is just trying to find guided mindfulness meditations that are short, that are quick, and then you can work your way up to a 30-minute if you are so inclined. But I always say start small, give yourself grace, and see how it helps you. All right, let's talk about what parents can do, because I know a lot of y'all are probably parents dealing with kiddos who have anxiety, or even if you have your own anxiety, your spouse has anxiety. I think there are several things that we can do. The first thing that I think we can do that is pretty easy to incorporate is just the giving choices. So when we have a plethora of choices, it could be really overwhelming. So I say stick to 2. So instead of saying, what do you want to wear today, which gives the kid, so many options, give 2 choices. Do you want to wear these jeans, or do you want to wear these pants? Give 2 choices. That way it kind of creates not only a semblance of control for you, because now you've controlled the situation and given 2 options, but it also gives the kiddo control too, because now they can make their own choice. So choices is such a great tool for parents. I have a 2-year-old, so choices are something that I incorporate a lot into my life. And don't be afraid, if the kiddo isn't making the choice, to choose for them and to explain, oh, you've taken too long, you didn't choose, so I'm going to choose for you. And that is a great way to kind of structure the environment, to create, they have choice, to control, and it also gives them control. They get to choose. But if they don't choose fast enough, I wouldn't be afraid to make the choice for them. Using visual supports is always helpful for our ASD population. Visual schedules with pictures so they know what to expect. All of that is going to decrease anxiety because they know what's coming. If you have your kid's stress hierarchy, if you've had your kid create a stress hierarchy, or they created one in therapy and you know what it is, you can reduce known stressors per that stress hierarchy. If you know that cleaning their room is a 12 and they just cannot cope with cleaning the room, maybe don't ask them to do that, because you know it's going to create a lot of problems. Maybe you work your way up to that. Maybe you reduce that stressor just for the time being. Doesn't mean they never have to clean their room, but just for the time being, we reduce that stressor and then work our way towards it. Daily exercise, so important. And I know for our ASD population, kiddos tend to be more sedentary and like those solitary activities, like the activities inside. But it is so, so, so important that at some point we find joy in movement, whether that be taking a walk around the block, walking the dog, going swimming. Like, there needs to be some sort of exercise, because we are animals. We are meant to be active. And when we're sedentary and we're inside all day, it affects our physical health and our sleep in a big way. And we'll talk about that more in the coming webinars as well. And then also practicing calming strategies yourself, modeling that behavior is so helpful. And as a clinician, when I'm working with parents, I encourage them to model healthy emotional awareness, healthy calming strategies. So if you're in, we're in Austin, Texas, so traffic is terrible. If you're in traffic and you're feeling really anxious and your kids are there, what a great learning opportunity for them, a teachable moment, if you will, for you to model, oh, wow, this traffic is very anxiety provoking. I can feel that I'm getting anxious. I'm going to practice deep breaths. Do you want to do it with me? Let's breathe in, 2, 3, out, 2, 3. And like, what a great modeling moment, a teachable moment for them, for not only you to identify what you're feeling in the moment, but to teach that skill for your kiddos. Another important thing, and I know we're getting low on time, so if you'll have any questions that are coming up, feel free to email us at info@johnson-center.org, and I'll answer them on Thursday, because I'll be back here on Thursday to talk about depression. So if you have any questions, you can email them, and I'll answer them on Thursday at noon if you're around. So a really important thing that I definitely want to hit before we're out of time is creating a stress plan. So when we're thinking about our kiddos on the spectrum, a lot of the times stress and anxiety is centered around routines or sensory things. So if you know that you're going to go to an environment that is going to change their routine, that's going to be a big sensory overload, create a plan. Have a plan in place of, here's what we're going to do if we get really, really overwhelmed. This is the room that we're going to go to at grandma's house. We're going to go into this room. We're going to practice these deep breathing techniques. We're going to get on this stress relieving app on our phone. We're going to squeeze this stress ball. Like, have a specific plan. It can be whatever works for your kid, but have a specific plan in place. Give specific expectations of, this is what I expect you to do if you get overwhelmed. Go to this room. Be very thorough, because kids can follow plans, especially if they know what to expect. So that is one of the best things to do, is to plan ahead. There's some really great guided meditations for kiddos that I'm going to talk about on a couple of screens, like in 2 screens of resources. So grab a pen. Guided meditations out of the UCLA Mindfulness Awareness Research Center. So guided meditations are basically, meditations with a script. So you're either reading the script or you're listening to the script, and it's just a really easy way to kind of get out of your head and to be more mindful. So one of the things I incorporate for kiddos is just the idea of paying attention to the soles of your feet. It doesn't have to be the soles of your feet if you're super sensitive or you don't like feet. For kiddos on the spectrum, it can often be pay attention to your hands, because some kiddos on the spectrum, do a lot of hand self-soothing things like hand wringing or touching their hands. So it could be just pay attention to some part of your body that feels relaxed. And when we get really stressed out about a certain situation, we think about that body part. And there's a whole guided meditation on the UCLA Mindfulness Awareness Research Center about using this technique. And it's so helpful for kids, because basically it's counteracting that hyperarousal. We have some situation that's stressing us out, and then we're being asked to focus on a body part that feels safe and secure and calm. And so it's that juxtaposition of, oh, I'm in this stressful situation, and yet I'm paying attention to this the calming of my hands. So it's really, really effective. It sounds stupid, but it's really, really effective. And you can use that guided meditation on the UCLA Mindfulness Awareness Research Center. I'll give the link in a little bit, but they're free. It's about 7 minutes long. I think that particular guided meditation, super helpful. All right, just remember, as parents or as people who work with kiddos with autism, saying no doesn't work. Saying don't be anxious is not going to be helpful, because these kids aren't doing this on purpose. Giving explicit instructions with incentives is going to be helpful. So, remember that plan, that stress plan that you have in place. Given explicit instructions. If we get overwhelmed, this is what we're going to do. And you can use visuals with that plan too. You know, you can have a schedule with like icons on it, like, you know, here's what we're going to do if we get stressed out. Use little visual aids. Have a calming space. Be predictable. Have a routine. Very important for our ASD population. Provide expectations. You know, the anxiety really reduces if we know what's expected of us, if we have a plan in place. Then we know what to do, right? And that's especially important for our ASD population who love a routine. Decrease the sensory overload, which goes back to our stress plan and having a calm place available. Really helpful too if you're gonna like take a trip to an overwhelming place. I know Disney World has like a whole special autism, you know, special things for kiddos on the spectrum. So like plan ahead. If you're gonna do something that's super sensory overloading, make sure you contact them. Hey, do y'all have an autism sensory room? Do y'all have, just plan ahead to decrease any sensory overload. And using technology, there's so many great apps that I'm going to talk about on the next page. I know I have 2 minutes. So a couple of helpful books is for kiddos, Sitting Still Like a Frog, Mindfulness for Kiddos. Also a really helpful book for me, what I use with clients is this one, Helping Your Anxious Child, by a step-by-step guide for parents. Super helpful, really helpful tips and tricks, step-by-step instructions on, and it's a parent's guide too. So it's built for parents to use for helping their kiddos with anxiety. So super helpful tip and trick. The technology apps are great. So the Stop, Breathe, and Think app for kids, the Take a Chill app for teens, so great. I love the apps because we're on our phones all the time anyways, and kiddos on the spectrum especially love their technology. So what an easy way to say, we're going to download this app. This is what we're going to do when we're stressed out. Really, really helpful if it can become part of your kid's routine or part of your routine. Super helpful. And here's the links for the guided meditation. So the UCLA, it's MARC, Mindfulness Awareness Research Center, all the guided meditations, super great. And then the guided meditations for kids specifically. I think that's a great way to kind of dive into meditation that's a little less overwhelming than trying to do yoga. So those are, write them down. We'll also have this webinar on YouTube, so you can come back to it. Okay, so I'm out of time. So if you have questions, email them to the email at the bottom of this screen, info@johnson-center.org. I will be back on Thursday to talk about depression. The material is different for depression. Treatment of depression is a little bit different, but I think all three of these, anxiety, depression, and sleep, kind of weave in together. And if you have struggles or your kid struggles with any of these things, I think all of the series is going to be helpful. So I'll be back on Thursday for depression, and then next Tuesday will be sleep, which I'm particularly excited about because as Americans, we have terrible sleep hygiene. So get excited to learn all the tips and tricks to lead a better, healthier sleep life. Thank you so much for joining me. I had so much fun. And I will see y'all on Thursday for depression.